My name is Katie. I work on Medium on the product team. And tonight I wanted to talk to y'all about self-definitions. It's something I've been thinking a lot about lately, the titles and labels that we give ourselves, how it affects our self-perception and how we express ourselves and carry ourselves in the world. So I want to talk broadly about expression and how the formality of titles and implicit expectations can really stifle the creative impulse, and how I think this is something we should challenge through small means that we'll get into throughout the night. So it's especially important to me now in the sort of societal and political moment that we're in. I think there's really a huge potential for change and a lot of possibility, and we should really keep that alive. You know, I watch this incompetent, hateful, terrible excuse of a human get elected to the highest office in this land, and it's really, really fucking demoralizing. Sorry, am I allowed to swear?
Yes.
Okay, tight. It's really fucking demoralizing, but also you need to take that and it also can be inspiring in that nothing should hold you down. There's no excuse, you know? So trying to tell that to myself, nothing should stand in our way of being whoever we want to be. Yeah, you know, expression. I drew some stuff for tonight. This is a woman expressing herself. That's tight. Possibility, you know. I didn't really cue this up well, so we'll get through it together. So in true millennial fashion, in today's Etsy, side hustle worlds full of multi-hyphenated people, I think a lot about how I define myself in the world. And a job title is one thing because that's something that's earned and is externally validated and placed upon you. But when it's a title that we give ourselves, somehow it feels scarier, it's harder, and I don't know, it just doesn't seem right to me initially. And so how we spend our time outside of work, outside of our day jobs, how do we talk about that in the world? How many people here write in their lives? Okay, that's a majority of the room. That's it. That's great. How many of you would consider yourselves a writer? Okay, that's significantly less hands than went up than when people said, I write. And why is that? The literal definition of writer is someone who writes. But somehow when it's nounified, there's this extra pressure and baggage and expectation that comes with that. And writer is just a word. But it freaks people out because J.K. Rowling is a writer, and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is a writer, and me, I'm not a writer, you know? So I really want to take a moment with that. Great, moment over. So when Tess asked me to speak tonight, she asked me for a bio. And I was like, cool, no doubt, for sure I can write a bio, and that is not at all stressful to me as a human being, that's chill. Great, yeah, bio. And then I put it on my to-do list, and then 3 days later she was like, hey, following up on this bio. I was like, for sure, because I was really in this existential spiral, and I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with the Enneagram test. Show of hands? Hell yeah. All right, so for those of you not familiar, the Enneagram is basically the better but darker and more cynical Myers-Briggs personality test. And I'm a type 3, which is the achiever. And basically the prognosis for the achiever in the Enneagram is that you are so concerned with how people in the world perceive you and self-validation and external validation, and you're very motivated and successful, but you're driven by that, and that's why you'll never find true happiness. I was like, damn, at me next time, personality quiz, Jesus. Apologies to any of y'all who are religious. So anyways, I spent a lot of time thinking about how I wanted to describe and present myself in the world. So I'm a product manager, and where I spend a lot of my time is obviously at work. And so I'm yeah, this is a meaty, complex problem. Let's write a spec. Let's define the problems, goals, non-goals, etc. But there's also things that I do that are important to my self-identity that are outside of work. So this was a version of the bio that I gave, initially was maybe going to send to Tess. This was me going through existential dread as a type 3. So my bio, I was okay, it's a product manager, woohoo, that's easy, someone gave me that title, cool. She writes, she draws, she codes, co-hosts a podcast, loves dogs, worships Beyonce, blah, blah, blah. That's cool. But I was sending this to my sister, and who I co-host this podcast with, who I like gut check everything against. And I was like, what do you think? She was like, well, just like call yourself a writer. I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's calm down. Like, that's like kind of stressful. Can I call myself a writer? Like, I don't know. I've written and I've been published and I self-published. But even though I write and even though I've like done that, I don't feel like I can call myself a writer because it implies that I'm like this other level. And I'm like not publishing regularly today. Like the last time I wrote something like that was public to the world was like a long time ago. I'm like, no. And even though I draw and illustrate, I'm like, can I call myself an artist? Like, I don't know. Somehow the idea of making like the jump and calling myself an artist was like disingenuous and felt like really, really scary to me. Because for me, like the nounification was like just, I took it to this whole other level that I wasn't ready for. And like, I was like, oh, I'm like an aspiring illustrator, but like art is like reserved for geniuses and like writing is like reserved for like intellectuals, you know? And that's on me. So, Hallie Bateman is this, she calls herself an illustrator. I don't know actually how to say that like together, but it works well when you like see the word. It's hard to say, illustrator. But she wrote this essay called "To Be or Not to Be an Artist," which really examines this idea for artists in particular and why it's hard to call yourself an artist. She met a woman on the plane named Gail, and Hallie was like drawing in her sketchbook, and Gail looks over and it's like, oh, are you an artist? And Hallie was like, yeah, for sure. And Gail, who was like 80 years old, had been drawing for like 60 years or so. And Hallie was like, oh, are you an artist? And she couldn't bring herself to call her that title because she was like, oh, that's not me. Like I draw, I've done it. And Hallie was like, why is that? Because she's been doing this longer than I've been alive, but she still doesn't feel like she can call herself an artist. So definitely encourage you to go read that essay. That's a really great exploration on like the artist side. And I've been thinking a lot about like creative spaces and like who is permitted to inhabit them. Like the Me Too movement has really shown that like the world, what we all know, that like creative spaces are really inhabited by a lot of like abusers and harassers and like generally shitty men. And like if that's the case, then the bar is like underground for like anyone else to be able to like consider themselves a creative and like enter this space. And like we all need to loosen up about like who can inhabit creative spaces and like feel empowered to do so. Because our self-definitions and like the titles that we apply to ourselves like really directly empower or limit like what we do in the world and like how we think about ourselves. So actually the difference in like this noun versus verb structure, like, you know, Katie writes versus Katie is a writer, has been studied in linguistics. There were two researchers from Harvard and Yale who published a study that examined the effects of essentialist linguistic labels on preferences. Yeah, I went deep for this talk, y'all. So essentialism implies, it's like the school of thought that like a characteristic is inherent in a person rather than a product of circumstance. Attitudes and beliefs are like important social markers of what we value, but for a while they were thought of being like very stable representations. Like they existed and that was chill and that was great, but they couldn't really be changed. However, they're not actually static, and like a growing body of evidence like work to prove this point. They're actually temporary constructions, and their manifestation is influenced by a wide variety of factors, like cognitive and social, you know, society, yourself, other people, and how like you move through the world. So the researchers of this like study wanted to test one aspect, the language that we use to express our attitudes, and specifically the minuscule variation of the grammatic form. So they tested they did three experiments. They tested different versions of statements for preferences. And I read through this like 22-page research paper describing the experiment methodology. And it was really great because it was like, you know, 198 Yale students like participated on campus for experiment 3 in exchange for Snapple or a candy bar. 3 students were eliminated for not following instructions. And I was like, tight. I remember when I was in college and I was like trying to survive on those like social study like payment stuff, and they would give me $5 or also a piece of chocolate and I'd be hype. Sorry from the bottom, and now we're here. So moment for that, which is great. So back to the experiments. In the first one, they were trying to test basically how a difference in construction of a sentence, either using a direct action verb or a noun, would affect like social perception by others. And so the social perception by others was an important part because we use linguistic cues in our day-to-day to like evaluate our judgment of others. And that's like really all we have to go on because we're not in other people's heads, and that's how we like perceive and assess other people in the world. So they conducted a test something like this. They didn't actually use Rihanna. They used like John or something, but I was like, Rihanna's a better example. So the noun version is Rihanna is a chocolate eater. And then the direct action verb example is Rihanna eats chocolate a lot. And what they found was that people who like the characteristics when they were described using nouns, which is an abstract linguistic form, which is something I learned for this talk, are more enduring and more central to a person's identity than if it's described as an adjective or if it's described as a direct action verb. So, Katie is an intellectual as a noun is like more central to my identity than if you say Katie is intellectual or, Katie acts intellectually or something like this. So the research showed that people with noun labels were perceived as stronger, and like that characteristic was stronger and more resilient and more stable, and like that characteristic of a person. And then they went to test and see if that was the same for self-perception, because self-perception, in contrast to like only being able to use cues to evaluate someone else's like behavior and how they exist in the world, we obviously are like very immersed in ourselves. So they were curious if like the same thing held, and they did find that the noun difference did increase like people's own perception in themselves of that characteristic in them. And so they also then take this like idea of linguistic cues and trying to affect behavior in a voting survey. So they sent a survey to 2 groups of people in California in 2008 before an election. And the first group got like some message that was like, go out and vote, like the verb version. And then the second group got a version that was the noun, like go be a voter. And what they found was that the group that got the noun survey had a significantly higher increase in voter turnout. And the researchers hypothesized this was because it was like more centrally tied to that person's identity, and therefore like convince them to go out and vote in higher numbers. So that's cool because the study reinforces that attitudes aren't pliable. They're like they are pliable, sorry, they're not stable and they're not rigid. And something as subtle as a change in grammatical form can actually affect people's attitudes and like people's behavior in the world. So we actually, this is really, really cool to me because we have the ability to change that. It is totally up to us, how we define and carry ourselves in the world. And something as small as a grammatical tweak as using nouns instead of verbs to describe ourselves can have a huge range of behavioral consequences. And language is really important to create and maintain our sense of self, who we are and who we want to be. So building on what Hallie wrote in her essay about to be or not to be an artist, I think we really need to expand the idea of this title beyond just your job or profession. And your label and self-definition is really totally up to you. It's totally how you choose to spend your time. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be good at something. If you write and you only journal and you only write for yourself, that's chill, but you're a writer because you spend your time and you choose to spend your time writing. It's a way to identify how you think. And if you draw, then you should call yourself an artist because you're filling your time with being able to create art. And if you code, then you don't turn coffee into code, you're an engineer, own that title. So Hallie also created this thing called an artistic license, which I just absolutely love. And her link is in this deck, which will exist on the internet at some point. It'll happen. But her website is in halliebateman.bigcartel.com. And it's called an artistic license. And her whole premise of this is what gives you the right, you do? And she codified it in this product, which is a license that's issued to make art. And you can fill out a custom illustration, custom, obviously your personal information. And it makes a great gift, which is, chill in the season that we find ourselves in. But it's also super relevant to what we're talking about tonight. And I think it's just a really cool embodiment of sort of the research that shows nouns actually matter. So I can call myself a writer because I spend time writing. And I can call myself an artist because I fill blank notebooks with sketches and drawings. And I can call myself a podcaster, although we need a better word for that because podcaster's super lame as a title. But I do spend time co-hosting and editing and producing a podcast with my sister. And I can call myself an ice skater. Like I ice skate. I spend 2 to 3 hours every single week like learning how to ice skate and getting better. And I'm like, oh, I can't be an ice skater because Michelle Kwan is an ice skater. But I do it and I invest time in it. So like, I'm on my way. I'm trying. And I can kind of do a waltz jump, which is chill. But these are all just words, right? Like artist is a word, writer is a word, engineer is a word. And when you give yourself this label and you call yourself an artist or a writer, like that really makes it real. And then that affects how you actually perceive yourself in the world. It affects your actions, it affects your behavior, and it can really open yourself up to different possibilities that you might not have considered had you not been an artist or a writer. Like, would you set up like a portfolio website if you didn't think that you were a writer? Like, I don't know, probably not. And I think coming up with like intentional and explicit definitions of ourself are like super, super important. So really I just want you all to give yourself like a license for self-definition. I like remixed Hallie's idea and like tried to broaden it for beyond people who consider themselves artists. And like fill it out, like start small. Like you can look yourself in the mirror and be like, I am a writer. Or like for everyone who raised their hand when they said, I write, but I don't consider myself a writer, like you do. I know it's scary and I know it's hard, but you can start with just yourself. And I think like the small thing is like you can just use nouns instead of verbs. Like it's not hard. Like it's different like grammar, and that can really help changing attitudes. So just try it, see how it works for you, and then if it like is terrible or is chill, like let me know. I'm on the internet. And thank you very much. I think young Katie described herself as a kid, as a pianist, as an artist, as an ice skater, as a sister, as a daughter, and as a writer. I wrote a lot of like books for like first grade essay contests and stuff as a child. Yeah, so I was probably like more liberal with my nouns. I'm making that up, but it seems like it tracks. Yeah, I think that's a really great question and something I've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about. The writer example for me is hard because I went to journalism school. So I'm like, okay, I have this degree to fall back on, so I can be like, yeah, I'm a writer. I like have a degree in journalism. But generally, like art, like I just started drawing really in the last like year. And like the title of artist has been really hard for me to be like, do I say that? Because it adds this expectation and like adeptness or like imply this level of expertise. And I think honestly, there's no formula, like it's really up to you. I think the point that I was trying to drive home was like that we generally should try to like help challenge that. And like that's not on you like as an individual, and that takes time, obviously, like a societal level of change, that when you say like I'm an artist or I'm a writer or I'm an ice skater, they don't expect like the cream of the crop for that. But in the absence of that, I think if you're not comfortable like ascribing that label or feeling the questions about it, then like you don't have to do that. But a world where like I'm trying to start calling myself an artist because I do spend time drawing. It is a significant part of how I spend my free time and energy. So I do feel like I'm putting in the time and work. Like I'm definitely not like a really like talented drawer, as you saw from like the slide deck. But I think if people ask like, oh, okay, like what do you draw? And I'm like, well, I illustrate the talks that I give sometimes, or I like doodle in my notebook. And if people are like, oh, well, anything I might have seen, you can be like, no, not yet, but like I'm working towards it. And like phrase it in that way of like, we're all working towards it together. Like I'm working towards it as like an individual. So that's how I think about it for myself. But like this doesn't apply to people who like don't want that like responsibility or like baggage, So I think it's up to you and you kind of have to make your own choice, but that's how I think about it. I hear that. I mean, for the longest time, like I was an engineer. I held that title. Like I started my career as an engineer. I'm a product manager now. But I was like, I didn't feel like I could call myself an engineer because I looked at like the white dudes who like called themselves engineers who like had all these open source libraries and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, I don't have that. So like I'm not at that level. And I don't have that level of work or like professional or whatever to like put into that. And so I think that, again, like it depends on like your friends, your group, and like how you feel comfortable in the world. I do think that's something to be cognizant of. And so if you're in a situation that's like you do feel that tension, but you don't feel like you have the ability to explain it, so like maybe in your Twitter bio or something, then I think being able to say something like, here's how maybe you don't do it in that setting where you don't feel like you can explain it to the way that you would like, but with your friends or people who are professional writers, and you start describing yourself that way, and you can have a dialogue about it and talk about maybe what their tension is with you career appropriating or something, and start to understand like what those causes are, would maybe help you like be able to move forward in that. And I think that in the same way, like I have a lot of writer friends who like are like, oh, I like did this portfolio site and I like coded some like CSS and like HTML, and I'm like, yeah, like you're a coder, like that's great. They're like, no, and like I hear that, and that's like definitely going to take time to overcome. And I'm not saying it's like everyone who like writes one line of CSS is like to say, okay, I'm going to go put this in like my Twitter bio and say I'm a full engineer, but like, I code, or like I write, like CSSer isn't really a noun, but like, nounifying that, or like just owning that, and like, if that's something that you actually prioritize in your life and want to move towards, like, I think it's actually good to put that pressure on, and like, that helps you rise to the occasion. But if that's not what you're trying to do in your life, like, I think that's chill, and you can just be like, I write sometimes. I'm like, that's great, So, yeah, again, I think it's like up to you, which is, cop-out answer, but. Yeah, that's a great question. The study was not about like demographics at all. It was really testing that one narrow slice of like how grammar changes people's perception of preferences, both other people and self, and they didn't mention anything. They said 198 Yale students participated in the study. They didn't give any information about who participated in the study. But I think that's a really good question, and I will follow up on Google, and we'll see. I don't know.
All right. Oh, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.